like to read to you a story called Titanicat. It's written by Marty and illustrated by Robert Papp. Here's a model of the Titanic behind me. Here's the title page. And a little bit of information to get us started with the story. Titanic was a ship as big as her name. She was 10 stories high and 4 blocks long. A floating city with her own restaurant, post office, library, swimming pool, squash courts, gymnasium, and even a Turkish bath. The new ship carried some of the world's richest people, as well as poor immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Croatia, Bulgaria, Portugal, and Syria among its 2,228 passengers and crew. Because she was built with watertight compartments, in her hull people thought Titanic was unsinkable. But the huge ocean liner hit an iceberg as she steamed across the North Atlantic on her maiden voyage. It was a moonless night, April 15, 1912, when the ship sank, taking with her some 1,500 people, a fortune in cargo, at least 9 dogs, and just possibly a cat. As far as history was concerned, Titanic's cat, because every ship that sailed in those days had a cat on board, could be counted among the dead. For 80 years, the true fate of the cat was just another of Titanic's unsolved mysteries, resting with the rusting hulk on the ocean floor. Then in 1985, explorer Robert Ballard discovered the long-lost wreck and new information began surfacing, like this story. Every time Jim glanced to the side, there was the cat, flashing the tip of her tortoiseshell tail at him all the way to the shipyard. Some claimed a tortoiseshell cat could see the future. Jim himself believed only that cats were lucky. His da worked in the Belfast shipyard, so Jim knew all the lore about ships and their cats. Jim reached the ship, rocking in its slip, towering above him. Its fresh black and white paint seemed to glow in the morning sun. Jim felt lucky to be crewing this beauty on her first voyage. It was his first voyage, too. Jim's eyes started with the 4 tall smokestacks, studying every detail as his gaze slowly traveled down to the dock. The same cat was sitting there on top of a piling. She jumped down and came towards Jim as if she'd been waiting for him all along. It was a good omen for a cat to walk towards you. Jim was certain this was going to be a great trip. He held out his hand. His da said Jim had a way with animals. The cat rubbed against his knees as he tickled her soft fur. Then the cat turned and disappeared into the open hatch on the side of the ship. A man in a blue uniform came up behind Jim. "Did you see our cat?" "Aye, I did, sir." Jim nodded at the ship. "She just went inside." "Are you here to crew for the trials, lad?" "I'm signed on as cabin boy, sir. James Jim Mulholland. I'll be going all the way to America." Jim couldn't keep the excitement out of his voice. "Welcome aboard." The man smiled and shook Jim's hand. "I'm Chief Steward Latimer, and from this moment on, you're in charge of that fool cat." "Aye, aye, sir. I'll find old 401 as soon as I stow my gear." It was a long-standing superstition not to call a ship by name while it was being built. That could be unlucky. Every ship under construction had a number. This ship was 401, and the cat would be called likewise. There were a lot of places to look for a cat on a ship 4 city blocks long. Jim searched from the compass platform on the boat deck to the boiler rooms at the bottom of the ship. The smell of fresh varnish was strong in the third-class general room, but no cat. Jim's whistle echoed back to him under the glass dome of the grand staircase, but no cat. Jim sighed with relief when he finally found the tortoiseshell on B deck in Café Parisien. Then he saw a kitten beside her. "So you have a family. It's a fine job you've done, little 401. Jim knelt and stroked each fluffy kitten. 4 new ship's cats in all. This voyage would be lucky indeed. Jim kept the little cat family in a box the next day as he polished chairs on A deck. The sharp tang of sea air made him daydream about the great voyage to come. He'd always wanted to go to sea and see faraway places. First, there would be 2 weeks of fitting and sprucing up. Then the launch and the ship's trials would begin. Jim worked hard, keeping the cat family close at hand. Once the ship got moving, he noticed that 401 would slip in and out of the box, putting an end to mice scurrying through the galleys. She caught a rat in an oatmeal bin Jim had forgotten to cover in the third-class storage cupboard. It was lucky she was around, he suspected, to keep him from getting in trouble. Jim filled the water tanks above the porcelain sinks in each third-class stateroom. "Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling," he sang as he worked. The kittens frisked to the lilt of the Irish lullaby, and the cat seemed to study Jim as he sang. Jim was on the boat deck, swabbing it clean with a mop, when he spotted one tiny bold kitten venturing out of the box and ducking under a lifeboat. There was no railing where the lifeboats hung. What if the kitten fell overboard? Jim squatted by the lifeboat and used his mop to pull the kitten back to safety. 401 watched it all with her mysterious green eyes. She began licking her baby clean as soon as Jim put it in the box, as if nothing had happened at all. But Jim always heard the rumble of her purr now, whenever he came close. So he was surprised when he stood at the rail 2 days later, watching the ship dock in Southampton. The cat was not at her usual spot beside him. Her kittens were sleeping down below in the box under his bunk, as they'd done during the 8 days of practicing stops and turns and night running. "Have you seen 401? Jim asked the porters and the deckhands. No one had, and passengers were starting coming up aboard. "Have you seen 401? He asked Mr. Latimer, but the chief steward only shook his head, too busy to answer. Jim leaned forward in surprise. Could that be his cat going down the gangplank, carrying a kitten in her mouth? Jim shaded his eyes. It was her. She placed her kitten in a coil of rope on the dock and streamed back into the ship. He could hear her loud mewing, even from here. A mewing cat meant a difficult journey. Jim knew the old sailor superstition as well as he knew his Da's Irish lullabies. He clutched the rail as she reappeared with a second kitten. First-class women in silks and furs and third-class men in rough brown wool streamed onto the ship. Jim pushed through the crowd, hurrying down to his berth. Even here, far below deck, he could smell salt water and fish. It was getting close to cast-off time, but the ship couldn't start her maiden voyage without her ship's cat. Jim found only one kitten. It was the one he'd rescued from under the lifeboat. He picked it up and cradled it. Surely 401 would come back. As he stroked the kitten's fur, he could hear people calling, "Bon voyage! Send me a postcard!" The call of, "All ashore who's going ashore!" startled Jim. He looked down at the kitten cupped in his hands. There was really no other choice. Jim bounded up the stairs and raced across the deck. "You're gonna miss the boat, boy," a crewman called. The gangplank was already being hauled in. Jim clutched the kitten and jumped. An ear-splitting blast from the ship's whistle told Jim the ship was on its way. It was sailing with his duffel bag and all his gear still on board. He couldn't be crossing the Atlantic after all. He wouldn't be seeing America. "I think you forgot someone," Jim muttered, glowering down at 401. "I hope you're happy. Now look what you've made me do." The cat looked up at him, unblinking. Well, the Titanic is one ship that doesn't need a full ship's cat for luck. She's unsinkable, the finest ship ever built. The cat didn't glance up as tugboats pulled the Titanic into Southampton Harbor. She was busy licking her kittens. 6 days later, Jim was hard at work delivering packages so he could rent a room for himself and the little cat family. The cat was his friend despite what she'd done. He'd taken care of 401 and her kittens on board Titanic, and he'd keep taking care of them until they could find another ship. A smaller, older, less exciting ship to be sure. Jim was so busy delivering bread and milk, newspapers and dry goods parcels that he missed the first whispers of trouble. But the whispers soon turned into cries. Jim waited with the crowd in Canute Street outside the White Star offices. Grim men in suits came out and said the Titanic had hit an iceberg. They posted the survivors' names. The kittens slept in a warm lump in the canvas bag Jim had slung over his shoulder. The cat followed close on his heels as he threaded his way through the throng to get a closer look at the lists tacked to the door of the White Star Line. One sheet said, "Saved." It was the shortest. The other said, "Missing." Jim's eyes scanned the long columns. His name was there. Jim scooped up the cat and looked into her bottomless green eyes. "You gave me your luck," Jim whispered, "and a thank you." The cat blinked and went back to licking her whiskers. There was really nothing else to say. I hope you enjoyed the story of Titanicat.